There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. It shows up in adults who did everything right. They built stable careers. They keep their homes in order. They are the ones friends call in a crisis, the ones who never seem to fall apart, the ones everyone quietly relies on without ever asking if they're okay. And yet, underneath all of that competence, there is a fatigue that never fully lifts, a low hum of being responsible for everything all the time that started so early in life they don't even remember agreeing to it, because they didn't agree to it. It was never a choice. It was a role assigned to them before they had the language to question it, and most of them are still playing it. Decades later, without knowing the curtain never actually closed. This isn't a story about hardship in the obvious sense. It isn't about neglect or abuse or the kind of childhood that makes headlines. Sometimes it is, but more often it is quieter than that. Almost invisible, the kind of thing that looks from the outside like a child who was simply mature for their age, responsible, independent, easy, the good one. And that word, easy, is exactly where this story needs to begin, because a child who seems too easy was very often a child who had to be. Picture an 8-year-old making dinner because a parent is too exhausted, too overwhelmed, or too absent to do it themselves. Picture a 10-year-old learning to read the emotional temperature of a room before they even understand what emotions are, adjusting their voice, their needs, their entire presence to keep the peace. Picture a teenager comforting a parent through a divorce, a breakdown, a financial collapse, becoming the steady one in a house that had no steady adults left. None of this looks like trauma in the moment. It looks like strength. It looks like a kid who is simply handling things well. But something is happening beneath that surface that almost no one names, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it in your own life. Psychologists call this parentification, and it describes exactly what it sounds like. A child stepping into a role that belongs to a parent, either practically, managing tasks and responsibilities no child should carry, or emotionally, managing feelings, conflicts, and needs that belong to the adults around them. And here is the part that makes this so difficult to identify from the inside. Parentified children rarely feel like victims. They feel needed. They feel important. Being useful becomes the very thing that makes them feel loved, and that confusion between being valued and being useful becomes the invisible architecture of their entire adult life. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable, because it means the praise these children received, the good kid, so mature, wise beyond their years, was often a reward for a loss they didn't even know they were experiencing. Think about the last time you struggled to ask someone for help, even when you desperately needed it. For many adults who grew up this way, that isn't a personality trait. It's a scar with a very specific origin point. If your early environment taught you that needs were inconvenient, that emotions were something you managed for other people rather than something you were allowed to have yourself, then somewhere along the way, your nervous system drew a conclusion that has quietly run your life ever since. Needing something makes me a burden. And a child who believes that will grow into an adult who would rather collapse quietly than ask anyone to catch them. Carl Jung offers a lens here that goes deeper than behavior alone. He believed that every child instinctively adapts to survive within their family system, developing what he called a persona, the mask worn to meet the expectations of the environment. For most children, the persona is simply a social skill, useful, flexible, something they can put on and take off. But for a child forced into premature responsibility, the persona hardens into something closer to an identity. The capable one, the strong one, the one who doesn't need anything. And because that mask worked, because it earned safety, approval, even love, the child never learns there was ever a self underneath it that needed tending to. This is the part most people never notice until much later in life, often in their 30s or 40s, sitting across from a therapist or lying awake at 2 a.m., asking a question that feels almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Who am I when I'm not taking care of something? But identity confusion is only the surface of what's happening. Something even more dangerous is unfolding beneath it, wired directly into the nervous system itself. Neuroscience has shown that a child's stress response system develops based on the demands placed on it during critical windows of development. A child who is regularly required to manage adult-level responsibility, adult-level emotion, or adult-level unpredictability is essentially training their amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, to stay on high alert far more often than it should. This isn't metaphorical, it is a physiological adaptation. The nervous system learns that vigilance keeps things from falling apart, and once that learning takes hold, it doesn't switch off just because the child grows up and the household stabilizes. This is why so many adults who grew up too fast describe a restlessness they can't quite explain, a discomfort with stillness, an almost involuntary need to be doing something, fixing something, anticipating something before it happens. Rest doesn't feel peaceful to a nervous system trained for vigilance. It feels exposed, unfamiliar, even mildly threatening. Which means the very thing these adults need most, permission to simply exist without producing or managing anything, is often the thing their body resists hardest. And this reveals something quietly devastating about the way society rewards this exact wound. A hypervigilant, competent, endlessly responsible adult doesn't look wounded. They look impressive. They get promoted. They get complimented. The same nervous system adaptation that cost them their childhood becomes, decades later, the very trait that earns them a corner office and the label of a high performer. No one applauds the fatigue underneath it, because no one can see it, least of all the person carrying it. Alfred Adler's work adds another layer to this pattern, one that reframes the entire question of why this behavior persists so stubbornly into adulthood. Adler believed that human beings are driven by a deep need to overcome feelings of inferiority, and that early experiences shape a private logic, a set of unconscious rules about how to earn significance in the world. For a child who was parentified, that private logic often crystallizes into something like this: my value comes from what I provide, not from who I am. Once that belief takes root, an adult can achieve extraordinary things and still feel a hollow, nagging sense that none of it counts, because the moment they stop producing, stop helping, stop holding everything together, the fear whispers that their worth might disappear along with it. This is why so many high-achieving, deeply responsible adults describe an exhausting, invisible pressure to keep proving something they can never quite name. It was never about the achievement. It was about a belief formed decades earlier that safety and love had to be earned through usefulness, and no accomplishment, however large, can ever fully satisfy a debt that was never actually owed. The next realization changes everything about how we understand this kind of adult, because what looks like exceptional maturity was often, at its origin, a survival strategy dressed up as a personality. Consider the eldest daughter who managed her younger siblings while a parent worked multiple jobs. Consider the son who became his single mother's emotional confidant at age 11, absorbing her stress as though it were his own to carry. Consider the child of addiction or divorce or chronic illness who learned to read a room before they learned long division. None of these children were simply mature. They were adapting to an environment that demanded adult functioning from a body and brain that were still developmentally. Children and developmental psychology is clear on what this costs. Skills acquired out of necessity are not the same as skills acquired through healthy development. A child who learns to manage a household is not thriving. They are surviving, and survival, however impressive it looks from the outside, always exacts a price. That price often shows up decades later, in relationships, in the strangest and most specific way. Adults who were parentified frequently find themselves, without meaning to, drawn into relationships where they once again become the responsible one, the fixer, the emotional anchor for someone less capable of managing themselves. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't bad luck. It is the repetition compulsion Freud identified, a psyche unconsciously recreating familiar emotional terrain, not because it enjoys the burden, but because the burden feels like the only kind of intimacy it ever learned to recognize. Being needed feels like being loved, and being simply loved with no task attached can feel disturbingly like nothing at all. This is where evolutionary psychology offers a clarifying, if uncomfortable, explanation for why this pattern is so difficult to break. For most of human history, a child's survival depended entirely on their usefulness and adaptability within the family unit. A child who could sense danger, manage tension, and contribute to the group's stability had a survival advantage over one who could not. In a very real sense, the hyper-attuned, over-responsible child was doing exactly what evolution designed a young nervous system to do under threat, prioritizing the group's stability over their own individual development. The tragedy is that this ancient survival wiring doesn't know the difference between a genuine threat and a modern household under ordinary stress. It simply responds, and once activated early enough, it can remain active for the rest of a person's life, unless something interrupts it. Interruption is exactly where Viktor Frankl's work becomes essential, not as an abstract philosophy, but as the precise turning point this pattern requires. Frankl's insight was never that suffering makes us stronger in some vague motivational sense. It was that between what happens to us and how we respond, there exists a space, and within that space lies the only real freedom a human being has. For someone who grew up too fast, that space is where the entire pattern can finally be examined instead of simply repeated. The impulse to manage everyone else's crisis, to anticipate needs before they're spoken, to feel guilty during rest, these are not character flaws to fight against. They are conditioned responses, and Frankl's gap is where a person can finally notice the response before automatically obeying it. The Stoics arrived at a similar truth from a different direction entirely. Epictetus taught that our disturbance comes not from events themselves, but from the judgments we impose on them, and for a parentified adult, one of the most deeply buried judgments is this: if I am not useful, I am not safe. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately amid the pressures of ruling an empire, kept returning to the same discipline, distinguishing what is within our control from what is not. For someone who grew up managing things far beyond their developmental capacity, Relearning this distinction is not a philosophical exercise. It is the slow, deliberate process of giving back to other people the responsibilities that were never actually theirs to carry in the first place. Jung believed the path forward here was not to erase the capable, responsible persona that was built out of necessity. That persona often contains real strength, real skill, real value. The goal in Jung's model of individuation was to integrate it, to recognize the mask for what it is without mistaking it for the entirety of the self beneath it. This means a person can remain capable, remain reliable, remain genuinely gifted at holding things together, while also learning, often for the first time, that they are allowed to need something without earning the right to need it first. This reframes the exhaustion this documentary opened with entirely. It was never simply tiredness. It was the accumulated cost of a nervous system that has been on duty since childhood. A mind that learned love had conditions attached before it ever learned what love without conditions could feel like. An identity built so thoroughly around usefulness that rest itself began to feel like a kind of danger. None of this means the past determines the rest of your life. It means the pattern finally has a name, and a name is where interruption becomes possible. The child who had to grow up too fast is still, in some quiet corner of the adult they became, waiting for permission that no one ever explicitly gave them. The permission to simply be cared for, without having to earn it through vigilance, usefulness, or endless management of everyone else's needs. So the next time you notice yourself anticipating someone else's crisis before they've even spoken, or feeling that low, persistent guilt during a moment of genuine rest, pause long enough to ask a harder question than whether you have time to help. Ask yourself who taught you that your worth depended on it, and whether that lesson was ever actually true. If this kind of psychology, the kind that finally puts language to something you've carried silently for years, is what you come here for, subscribe, because there's more of this waiting for you.